عرض كتاب مواثيق النبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم مع النصارى للكاتبة دايك. دايك كاتبة وباحثة ومترجمة هولندية. يعرض الكتاب جانبا من السيرة النبوية الشريفة. يتعلق الكتاب بستة مواثيق للنبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. يفرد الكتاب فصلا للسياقات التاريخية للمواثيق المبرمة في العهد النبوي. يوضح الكتاب كيف غدت تلك المواثيق مرجعا للخلفاء المسلمين.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dايك. I'm from the Netherlands and I've wrote the book De Verdragen van Mohammed met de Christenen, which is in English, The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with the Christians. It's a small book, as you can see, but I will first tell you why I wrote it. It's about 6 treatises of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and it was part of a bigger academic project, and I was asked to translate them into Dutch by Dr. Andrew Morrow, and it's been translated in many languages actually. But in Dutch it was not available, and then there was this Christian publishing house, actually part of a monastery, and that's quite funny because one of the treatises is actually with a monastery. But they asked me to write a book in Dutch, and then I proposed to them that these treatises would be a nice subject for them. And then I was asked also to add historical context on the book and bring more of my own opinions to it as well. So that's what I did, and then the book became a project. So the content of the book is about, of course, the 6 treatises of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But before that, I give a whole chapter, so it's actually around half of the book is a chapter on the historical context, about the biography, a short biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to also inform the reader about the context of the time. Because if you read these treatises just out of the blue, without any proper knowledge beforehand, you don't know anything about the ideas of the time, about the context, about the historical and geopolitical situations of that time, it would be a bit hard sometimes to understand the lines, even if it's translated in your own language. So in that case, for that purpose, I've written the historical context chapter. And after that, it's the translations of the Ihd, of the Aqd, which are 6. One of them, for example, is with the monastery of the Christians of the Sinai monastery. And another one is, for example, with the Christians of Najran, who visited the Prophet at least 1 time, maybe 2 times. And then a third part of the book, it's the last part, it's to make the book also useful for our times here and now, especially when you live in a community with Christians and Muslims, but also for other faiths it might be interesting. It's a chapter with questions for conversations. So to stimulate dialogue between different people, but also to stimulate self-reflection, because the first questions are towards the self. So the content of the book, in the first chapter, I elaborate on the historical context, of course, to introduce the Prophet, peace be upon him, to non-Muslims, to people who've never read anything about Islam. So the idea is that you're able to read the book if you do not know anything, you don't have any foreknowledge about Islam. But then in the chapter I also try to go fast, go deep, so that for people who are well read in Islam, they will also find new things, new different interpretations, for example, where I discuss them. I think a big part of the chapter on the historical information is also a critical analysis of the authenticity of the covenants, because there is discussion about the authenticity of these covenants. And I find it interesting to elaborate on it because some Muslims, they say, no, you don't have to believe these covenants because they're not reliable, so therefore we don't have to deal with them at all. And I take a middle position in this book. I elaborate how historical context studies are done. So you don't just read the covenant itself, you do a study to the paper of the manuscript. You date it, you try to see if there is supportive information in other manuscripts. You compare the manuscripts. For example, if you have 3, 4, 5 manuscripts that are found in completely different places in the world, and they have some lines that are actually saying exactly the same, that makes us more reliable. What we also find in some of these covenants is sometimes they literally quote a hadith. And then of course these hadiths are reliable, especially if they are also found in Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. So if there are commonly shared references, it makes these manuscripts more reliable. So some parts you will find that these manuscripts are very reliable. Some parts you think, I'm not really sure. But then I let it open to the reader what to find of that. And then another part what is interesting in this historical study is that you will see in different areas of the Islamic history, you'll see rulers of different centuries, different places, citing these manuscripts, these covenants, and making them into new pacts. And the last example of this is of the last caliph, the last Ottoman caliph, who cited these treaties, this ihd, and he called it ashtiname, of ihtiname, and he cited that in his own pact that he made with the Christians of his time. So we have the last caliph citing these. So that makes it, I would say, a kind of sunnah, a kind of habit of rulers of Islam to make treaties with Christians and also other communities. But this book focuses on the Christians only. So the position that I take is to step away from the discussion whether it is completely authentic or completely not authentic, but to focus more on the idea of making treaties, making pacts with other communities. And to reflect on that idea, what if the Prophet, peace be upon him, lived in our times? How would he make treaties with other people? And to make a more reflective process on that idea. Because we know that it was of the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to make treaties with other people. Even in the times that he was being bullied, that he was being treated very, very bad in Mecca, it was always the first step to make a treaty with other people. That's where he was known for. That is especially why he was invited to Medina. They asked him to come to Medina, and the first thing that he did upon the arrival in Medina was to make the Pact of Medina with the Jews and the polytheists of Medina. So you will see that the first step in encountering different people was always to make a pact, to make peace, to make a treaty. So in this book I try to reflect more on 3 ideas. It's freedom. How do we establish freedom for all people? On peace, how do we establish peace? And if you have established that, maybe we can even take it a step further, and how do we create friendships? And then we have, of course, also the questions that I raise in the introduction. Then we have the translations, and you will see sometimes that the 6 different pacts, they will have whole paragraphs that are completely the same. So if you're reading it in Dutch, you can quite quickly read through them, because if you have read the first, the second will be very similar and the third as well. Maybe you find some changes or some slightly different emphases, but in general you will find pieces that you can just copy paste, or that I could just copy paste while translating, because it was exactly the same. And then in the last part, I'm focusing on the questions for conversations. And then I start with self-reflective questions, so that the reader can ask to itself, so his or herself. For example, what do I need for peace? For example, I live in the Netherlands. I'm a Muslim, I'm part of a minority group. This is my position. What do I need for peace in my country? But my position is completely different if I live in a Muslim country where I'm a Muslim and I'm part of a minority group. What do I need for peace then? So with these reflective questions, I try to light the fire for us being able to emphasize with people in different contexts, but also to reflect on your own position. What is my own position? Am I part of a minority or a majority? Because this is important how you treat other people. Because if I'm part of a minority, what I need for peace might be different when I'm part of a majority. Because the other question that I ask is, what am I willing to do for someone else to offer peace? If I raise this question as a minority, what am I willing to do for peace? Maybe I cannot do anything because maybe I'm suppressed, for example. I cannot do anything for someone else. But if I'm part of a minority, I am actually able to offer someone else peace, because you're in a position of power. So in this whole process, in this whole book, I find it more important that we try to reflect on our own positions and what we can do actually to make the world better. And the last question, and I find this really interesting, and I also had some positive feedback of some schools, but also some dialogue circles from preachermans and imams who work together. And one of the questions that I ask in this book is to write a paper, small paper, just like 500 words, on the idea if you could write your own pact of peace or treaty for peace, how would it look like? Write it. Write your own treaty. And this might be interesting for you as well. You are listening now to this story. So also an assignment for you. Please write your own treaty for peace with the community you're living in. How would it look like? I'm interested. So this was the content. For who did I write this book? It's actually for a very wide audience, I would say. It's written for everyone who is interested in the topic, but I think it's especially interesting for people who don't know anything about Islam, because it will give you some content, it will give you context, and because we're living now in these days in a very, I would say, interreligious times, globalized times, we do face each other whether we like it or not. It raises questions, especially how we should deal with each other. And in that case, this book is very interesting because it makes us reflect on how we will interact with each other. And it gives you information about this interesting time when Islam became a world player, I would say, in politics, in religion, and it's here to stay. So it's interesting to read about these early times and how pacts of treaties of peace were made back then. So if you don't know anything about Islam, it's interesting. And it's also interesting for Muslims because these pacts, these treaties of the Prophet, peace be upon him, with the Christians are not that well known. Even though the last caliph did cite them, we forgot about them. There have been studies about the why. I will not go into that now, but I think Muslims will find new information in this book as well. So actually, for everyone who's interested, you should read it in Dutch. And I'm happy I could share this story with you. Thank you so much, and may peace be upon you all. Assalamu alaikum.